Hey, what is up, mortals? It is Robo Celestial here with a new video for you. Welcome to part 12 of What If Deku Had the Sharingan. I just wanted to greet you guys by just saying, sit back and relax, you're in for a treat. So, we begin. Hero killer caught by Endeavor, pro hero and UA student found dead. The media was going crazy over what happened. 10 UA natives' bodies were found in an alleyway, wounds matching the hero killer's mo. It wasn't long afterward that Endeavor caught the villain. Though not without nearly getting killed in the process. The entire situation was a living hell. News of the incident spread like wildfire. It didn't help that the USJ incident was still fresh in the minds of the masses. Consecutive tragedies tracing back UA in one form or another garnered ridicule from the public. Despite the criticism, students continued on in their work studies. Izuku thought back to 4 days ago when they were getting ready to head out for their internships. He and Achako had tried to comfort Tenya, show that they were there for him. Apparently, that hadn't been enough. This is my wife fault, Izuku whispered to himself. Should have done more. A steady stream of tears poured from his eyes. He'd just gotten off the phone with Achako. She was hysterical, they both were. Their friend was murdered the previous night. Izuku still hadn't heard anything from Katsuki. He doubted he would. The last time Katsuki had to confront his emotions, he ended up shutting everybody out. Izuku's trembling, stiff form was hunched over a tiny kitchen table. His hands were in his lap, still gripping his phone with white knuckles. The darkened room felt almost comforting, in a strange way. Having some time alone for once would have been refreshing, if only events had turned out differently. It felt, at least a little cozy, even if the kitchen area was opened up to the living room. Midoriya, hey, a voice gruff with age and concern called out to Izuku, it's alright, kid. You're here with me. Look, my eyes, full o' life. He felt a hand comfortingly rub his shoulder. Izuku shifted his gaze to look at the older hero next to him. His compact demeanor made it so Izuku didn't have to look up to see him. The man went by Gran Torino. He was All Might's former teacher and reached out to offer an internship after what happened at the sports festival. Izuku took temporary residence in his home while interning with him. That's not divided by it's not I killed him. Id is dead. I saw that he was troubled and I didn't do anything. As he spoke, Izuku's body trembled and tightened along with his voice. Gran Torino's face grimaced. His brows furrowed in and lips tightened. During their time together, Izuku spent his training mostly talking about the USJ event. The point of their internship had been to help Izuku overcome what had happened. As a result, Gran Torino ended up hearing everything about the events leading up to the attack. Iida was a name that came up often. Alright, boy, tell me what happened. Gran Torino pulled out the chair across from Izuku and listened intently. He let the younger lad go on, never urging Izuku to say more than he wanted. Once everything was explained, they sat in silence for a few minutes. Izuku stopped crying towards the end, but the evidence of his tears still remained. You can't blame yourself for what happened, kid. He was gonna do it no matter what you said. Gran Torino's gaze shifted downcast. A faint smile tugged at his lips as his eyes glossed over with phantom tears. Time froze the moment he stopped talking. For a moment, he was lost in his own world. An old friend of mine did the same thing. Gran Torino started again. A dear departed friend lost their life to a villain. Toshinori and I didn't have much time to mourn when it happened, we had to start his training right away. Upon hearing this, Isaac's mouth went ajar and his brows arched the slightest bit. All Might's teacher was, Gran Torino mumbled out a quick confirmation, already knowing how that sentence would end. This new revelation about All Might predecessor came as a shock to Izuku. It shouldn't have been. Heroes die on the job all the time. He had assumed since One for All was such an immense power, most of the previous holders could have been an exception to such a fate. After thinking it over again, it made sense that some, probably most, of the predecessors could have met their end at the hands of a villain. How many of them died? How many of those deaths could have been prevented? What did All Might do when he was going through this? That last thought snapped Izuku out of a stupor he hadn't realized he'd fallen into. After coming back to reality, he realized Gran Torino had gotten up and was fiddling with the microwave. We didn't have a choice, we had to move forward no matter what. We'll take it easy today, but tomorrow is going to be hell. Use this loss to push yourself forward. Izuku hung onto every word Gran Torino said. It was probably the same advice he had given All Might back in his days of training. A shaky nod was the most Izuku could muster. Today, he would mourn the loss of his close friend. Tomorrow, he would hold him close in memory and push forward. Izuku made a silent vow to himself. He'd become the greatest hero alive and never let what happened to Tenya happen again. Not a half-bad choice, Toshinori. He's a lot like you. Gran Torino smiled at that thought. He was going to have to deal with training another All Might. Before we get back into the story, I would like to say that we've got a second channel called Anime Deep Dive. Anime Deep Dive goes over the hard facts of the anime presented. Now, in case you guys didn't know, we have a third channel called We The Celestial Naruto, What If? We The Celestial Naruto What If mainly focuses on our Naruto What If series. If you are interested in content like this, please go check the description below or click the eye icon in the top right corner. Now with that out of the way, let's get back into the story. That night, Izuku slept restlessly. He was trapped back at the USJ, face to face with the Nomu again. Its hulking figure towered over the boy as its hand wrung tightly around his arm. Izuku's strained, trembling, wide-eyed gaze was fixated on the monster's vacant white orbs. They were so empty. His body froze. There should have been life in there. Something to grab onto. Anything. Please. All too soon, the world around him vanished. Izuku's very concept of self was stripped from existence. He was utterly ensnared by those eyes. He couldn't move, he couldn't breathe, he couldn't think. The inexplicable desolation that was the Nomu's eyes became all-encompassing. It was mere seconds and an eternity all at once. Then, something happened. A slim, muscular man stood, leering above an all-too-familiar set of armor. No, this couldn't be happening. His nose-less face was obscured by a ragged cloth mask and matching red headband. Izuku knew that man. His sharp facial features and long, snake-like tongue matched the blade-clad aesthetic of his mostly black outfit. The tight tank top he was wearing showed off his bandaged wrapped arms with which he held his weapon. A chipped, jagged katana that was aimed towards Tenya Hart. His spiked combat boot-clad foot pinned the young hero's exposed head to the ground. Tenya stared at Izuku, his face devoid of any expression. It was like looking at a doll's painted-on face. Just staring and staring and staring. Izuku couldn't do anything but return his gaze. Then, in one ferocious, swift motion, the blade sunk into Ida's back. The squelching noise echoed through Izuku's mind, and red poured from the fatal wound. As Tenya's very essence faded, so did the color in his eyes. They faded and faded and faded until all that was left were the whites of his eyes and tiny specks for pupils. Suddenly, everything went cold. They were those eyes. The first thing Izuku noticed when he woke up was the screaming. Who was screaming? Then he felt it in his throat. He was screaming. The next thing he noticed was how wet his eyes were. Why was that? Then his heartbeat, it was thumping, banging on his ribcage trying to get out. Next was the light dizziness in his head and his sharp cold breaths biting into his mouth, drying his throat. He was hyperventilating. Had he been doing that this whole time? Izuku's thoughts ran a mile a minute and stilled at the same time. It was impossible to keep up. Instinctively, his arms went to comfort himself, but they were restrained. When did that happen? How did that happen? That's when he noticed a voice behind him. Divided by "It's all right. It was just a dream." It almost instantly registered as Gran Torino's voice. Everything came to a head after that. Fresh tears started seeping out of Izuku's eyes as his body went from thrashing around to unsteady shaking. The screaming ended, and his throat felt raw. It happened again. He hated it. He couldn't keep going like this. He couldn't keep living like this. It was too much. It hurt too much. "I'm gonna go make some tea. Once you're settled we can drink some and call Eraserhead." Gran Torino gave Izuku a faint smile before heading to the kitchen. After a few moments, Izuku started his breathing exercises. Breath in, hold breath out. Repeat. It took some time, but eventually, he was able to start making his way to the kitchen. Every step was hesitantly placed with half a moment's pause between each one. The bags under his eyes weighed him down, and his shaky arms clinging to each other did little to soothe him. Izuku winced once exposed to the blaring light of the kitchen. Gran Torino sat at the table, waiting for him with 2 piping hot cups of tea. After being coaxed, Izuku took the only other seat. They sat for what felt like hours, slowly sipping their tea in silence. Despite how time seemed to drag on, the kettle emptied all too soon, and Izuku knew he couldn't delay any more. With bated breath, Izuku pulled out his phone and clicked the number. Every electronic ring coming from the phone felt like taking a step further into a lion's den, The click of someone picking up nearly startled Izuku when it happened. What happened? Eraserhead's voice strained to keep its usual calm facade. After a few moments and a couple deep breaths, Izuku forced himself to disclose the contents of his dream. They spent hours on the phone, talking in circles until Eraserhead was able to get Izuku to say Tenya's death wasn't his fault. He didn't believe it, and they both knew that, but over time he would. Izuku just had to keep saying it until then. Once they were done, Izuku went out to train with One for All and clear his mind, while Eraserhead picked up the call of his other problem child. Everyone's internship sauntered on. After the incident, everyone in Class 1 seemed to be checking up on each other during the following days. In addition to his regular calls with Eraserhead, Hound Dog, and his psychiatrist, Izuku got used to getting constant messages and calls from Ochako and his mom. The only people who hadn't been abuzz with making sure everyone was okay were Katsuki and Shoto. The former hadn't talked to anyone except Izawa and Hound Dog, while the latter only sent a message to Izuku. "I'm sorry," was it said. Momo and Izuku tried to get in touch with him multiple times after, but they never got a response. Katsuki's lack of response was the most worrying. Izuku, Ijiro, and Ochako repeatedly tried to get in touch with him, but it never worked. A few of the other students took to asking Eraserhead about him, but they'd always get the same response. "He's fine. Focus on your internship. You don't need any unnecessary distractions right now." Things seemed to get worse and worse as the week went on, though. The media had spun the story to blame UA unrest began to further tighten its grip on society as a result. Stain's ideology also began to spread within particular groups that already had their gripes with heroes as a whole. Most of the uproar seemed to quell after All Might gave a speech about the incident on UA's behalf. But the pot had already been stirred. After everyone's work studies ended, classes resumed. Nobody in Class 1 could make eye contact with each other. Red eyes, dark circles, slumped shoulders, and frowns seemed to perpetuate through the students. The only thing that could be heard as they waited for their homeroom teacher to arrive was the ticking of the clock. Time seemed to drag on longer and longer as they waited for Eraserhead to arrive. While some got antsy, wishing for a distraction, others stayed still, silently hoping that if they didn't move, then maybe the day would pass them by and they wouldn't have to deal with reality. The sliding of the door made more than a few students wince. Eraserhead scanned the room. As expected, nobody looked his way. There were 4 students, in particular, he paid extra attention to, though. Katsuki was the first one his eyes were drawn to. He sat surprisingly still, with his gaze seemingly fixated on the desk in front of him. His calm expression was worrisome for Eraserhead. Usually, Katsuki was full of emotion, yelling instead of talking and howling out laughter. This shift in behavior was by no means a surprise, though. Their phone calls during the internships got a lot shorter, with Katsuki's responses ending more abruptly. Eraserhead's next target was Izuku. He seemed to be taking what happened surprisingly well. Keyword being seemed. They talked a lot over the phone a couple days after the incident. It was self-evident he had been forcing himself to say anything at the time. Hopefully, extra sessions with Hound Dog would be helpful. The third student Eraserhead focused on was Shoto. He seemed to be in a similar state to Katsuki. Izuku had gone out of his way later in the week to inform Eraserhead of the message he received from Shoto. No doubt, he was blaming himself. Lastly was Ochako. She was a lot easier to read than the boys. Her eyes were swollen red, probably from crying, and they never left the vacant seat in front of her. This was the type of loss Eraserhead hoped his student wouldn't have to deal with. Not this soon. Withholding a sigh, Eraserhead made his way to the teaching podium. His scrutinizing eye not once leaving the student. Today was going to be a rough one. The click-clack of his shoes against the hard tile floor reverberated throughout the room. Nobody made an effort to acknowledge when it stopped, though. What happened was a failure on behalf of us adults. You kids have no business feeling responsible. I can't just tell you to keep your chin up, but this is something you will experience on the field. Don't let this hold you back from your goals. I'll watch over you, along with everyone else here. Let's try to do things right going forward. Most of the students seemed to understand and accept what Eraserhead was saying. It was going to take time for the class to bounce back from this, but he knew that when they finally did, they would be stronger for it. Thank you all for watching the video to the end.